Now I'm recording, so we should be all set. And you should be seeing the screen. Okay, any questions? Okay. Okay, can you Zooming people hear me? See everything? Let me get some confirmation. Okay, good. Good. Just have this fear of going through a whole hour and 15-minute talk and then finding out I was muted. So, okay. We as we go through, we're in chapter 9, continuing today. I think we should be able to get finished with it. I really want you to use this chapter to reinforce your understanding of things that we've already been talking about, because in this chapter we are continuing to talk about consumer surplus, producer surplus, gains from trade, and use these ideas to help us understand efficiency better and help us understand the deadweight loss that results from various things like taxes, like subsidies, and here we're going to see from tariffs. And in the lecture today, I've put in a number of quiz questions where I'm going to give you a question. I want you to look at the graph, write down your answer, and be honest with yourself and as to whether you know the right answer, because these questions are going to be, you're going to see essentially the same questions, but just slightly different graphs on the exam. So by the time we get through with this chapter, you should know if you're ready for those kinds of questions or if you're not. So when I give you some questions to answer in a second, draw it on your paper, work out an answer, write down your answer, and then notice if you understand it. And if you don't get the right answer, and if it doesn't make sense to you, it's very important to go back and improve your understanding of it, or send me an email or set up a Zoom session and I can help you with it. All right, so to review what we did last time, we're thinking about trade. Trade, we said that a trade is a trade is a trade, whether you're trading with somebody across the street or on the other side of the world, the same basics apply. And so we started out saying, well, what if we have a country where they can't trade with anybody in any other country? Well, then you've got demand curve, supply curve. On the previous graph, identified so I want you to draw the graph, identify the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the total gains from trade. And so this is the graph you want to draw. And just a reminder, as we go through all of these lectures, when I put up a graph, don't just look at it. It's important that you draw it yourself, because even though this is recorded and you can go back and you can see it in the recording, there's something about picking up the pen, drawing the graph, that engages your brain at a deeper level. So you need to be drawing these graphs, and every time you draw the demand curve, you're thinking about what that represents. You're thinking about what the supply curve represents. All of those things engage your brain more deeply than if you just stare at a picture on your screen in front of you. So the demand curve, supply curve, equilibrium. First question was, where is the consumer surplus? So where is it going to be? Yes.
It's on the other side of the demand line, but above the equilibrium point.
Okay. That's basically right. But the way I would say it that is most concise is anytime we're talking about consumer surplus, it's the area below the demand curve and above the price line out to the quantity that is going to be purchased. So here's the demand curve, here's the price line. Consumer surplus is going to be everything below the demand curve and above the price line. And that is going to be this area here. Okay, so and as we go through it, don't just calculate it, but remember what it represents. Consumer surplus represents the net gain to consumers. It's the difference between what they're willing to pay for something, what it's really worth to them, the most they're willing to pay, and what they actually have to pay. And we said that the most they're willing to pay is the entire area under the demand curve. So all of this area represents the most they're willing to pay for this quantity. And what do they have to pay? Well, they have to pay the price per unit for each of these units. So you multiply this dimension by this dimension, that gives you the area of this rectangle. And that's what they actually have to pay.
So the quantity line that has the the y-axis to the equilibrium point times the x-axis to the equilibrium point, or to the equilibrium line.
For calculating what?
That's the Jesus, you just said it.
What they have, okay, what the consumers will have to pay.
Yeah.
Just think of, if you pay $15 per unit and you buy 5 units, then you automatically know, well, that's 15 times 5. Well, to figure out what the consumers in total are going to pay, that's just the price per unit times the number of units that they're going to purchase. So that represents the price. That represents the quantity they're buying. So when you multiply the price times the quantity, that gives you the area of that rectangle. And that is what the consumers actually have to pay.
So that's price per unit times quantity demanded?
Yeah, well, it's going to be the same thing. Because the only quantity that's relevant here is the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, which is right there. So the rectangle is what the consumers actually have to pay to get these units. And the area under the demand curve, which is all of this, is what they were actually willing to pay. And so the difference between the two, this whole area minus the rectangle, is the area I'm coloring in now. That's the net gain the consumers are getting, because they're getting units that are worth more to them than they actually have to pay. And consumer service, it's such an important concept. In a way, it's simple, but it takes people a while to really grasp it fully. And so don't think that just because you've heard me say this before that you got it. You got to keep trying to think through it more fully. So I asked, where is the consumer surplus? Then question, where's the producer surplus? Yeah. So now think about that, and on your paper, draw in where the producer surplus is. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And as you're doing that, remember there's an easy way to identify graphically where the producer surplus is. It's always going to be the same. It's always the area below the price line and above the supply curve. And what does it represent? It always represents the net gain going to producers. And that is going to be the difference between what the producers actually receive and the minimum they would have been willing to accept. Okay. We've already said that the rectangle here represents what the consumers are actually paying. Whatever the consumers are paying, that's what producers are receiving. Okay, so our rectangle here is once again important, okay, because that rectangle represents the price per unit times the number of units that are being sold. So price times quantity is the amount of revenue the producers are going to get, because that is the amount of money the consumers are spending. And that is going to be the area of that rectangle. Okay? So that's what the producers are getting. What would they have been willing to accept? What's the lowest they would be willing to accept? Well, we said that that is always going to be represented by the area under the supply curve. Okay? So the producers were willing to, are going to receive all of this rectangle. They would have been willing to accept this dotted area down here. So the difference between what they actually received and what they would have been, minimum they would have been willing to accept, is the cross marked area here. So again, remember the graphical shortcut. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price line. Producer surplus is the area below the price line and above the supply curve. Okay. It's the gain going to consumers. It's the gain going to producers. And when you add those together, that gets us the total gains from trade, the net, the benefits that society is getting from the opportunity for these units to be produced and sold. You want to understand that well, because there's so many places where it's going to come into play. In fact, the very last thing we talk about in this class is still going to be talking about consumer surplus, producer surplus, efficiency, deadweight loss. All right. All of that was where we just had a trade between people in one country. Then we said, well, what if we had the opportunity to trade with people in other countries? Okay? And what if the world price for this product is only $10? Okay? Remember, we talked about this last time, but this is a graph that it's easy to misunderstand. So be sure you understand the assumptions we're making. We are assuming that consumers in this country can now purchase from producers in other countries, and that those producers are willing to sell as much as people want to buy at a price of $10. Okay, so basically the world supply curve is horizontal. That's what we're assuming, to keep it relatively simple. So look at this graph, and we have some questions. Well, one question in the previous graph, the amount that will be imported or exported. Let's go back. How do we know if this country is going to be importing the product, or are we going to be exporting the product? Because obviously we do import some things and we export other things. How can you look at this and determine, well, first ask yourself, is it going to be imported or exported? Okay. What do you think?
Say if there's a difference in something, I think it's the difference demand or the difference between what's being demanded versus what's being supplied.
What you have to do is look at the difference. You're right. You have to look at two quantities. And as I've said before, when you look at a graph, just stop and take in what's there. Okay? Because it is so easy to look at a graph, look over it quickly, and not really understand anything of what's there. Okay? You got the domestic supply curve, which is nothing new. It's just the domestic just means this is how much U.S. producers are willing to supply at the, this is the quantity U.S. producers are willing to supply at different prices. You've got a demand curve. This is how much American consumers want to purchase at each price. We know if we don't have the ability to trade with other countries, then we would be in equilibrium at this price, which I'm assuming is $16. And we're assuming that the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied would be 100 million. When we introduce foreign trade and we have a world supply curve here at $10, ask yourself, what does that supply curve mean? It means that there are producers in the rest of the world who are willing to sell to Americans, American consumers, as much as we want at a price of $10. So if the price is now $10, what are American consumers going to do? That's really the first question you ask. And you say, well, the demand curve shows us that at a price of $10, the quantity demanded, the amount that U.S. consumers will want to buy, is going to be right here. We're assuming that's 150 million. Okay. How do we know if we're going to be importing or exporting? Well, that depends on how much American producers want to produce. And at that $10 price, how do we find the amount that American producers want to produce? Well, we look at the supply curve. And American producers at that $10 price are only willing to supply a quantity of 50 million. So if American consumers are going to buy 150 million, but American producers are only producing 50 million, where's the additional 100 million coming from? It must be coming from foreign producers. So this gap between the amount that American consumers want to buy and the amount that American producers are willing to sell, that represents the amount that we will be importing. Okay? We're consuming a larger quantity than we are producing, so we are going to be importing from other countries. It's not bad to import things. If you think back to chapter 2, back in macro, we talked about comparative advantage. We want countries to specialize in those things for which they have a comparative advantage, those things that they're more efficient at producing. And every country is going to have a comparative advantage in some things and not in other things. So it's not bad to import. When we import, there's a benefit in that we are buying from producers in the rest of the world. We're buying from them at a cost that's lower than if we produced it ourselves. Okay? Just like I had because of the hurricane, I had a tree that fell, and I had to basically import the services of a tree person. And I had to pay him a significant amount of money, but I benefited from that because he could do it more cheaply than I could do it myself. It's not bad for an individual to pay someone to provide a service, just as it's not bad for a country to pay somebody else to sell us stuff. You want to get each thing at the lowest cost. And basically what this graph is telling us is that in our equilibrium before the trade, it's costing $16 per unit every time a consumer wants to consume this product. But when we can trade with the rest of the world, we can get the product more cheaply. And so if you can get it for $10 from other countries, and it's going to cost $16 to get it from here, it's more efficient to buy it from them. So we're going to be importing. And what's the amount of the imports in terms of quantity? Yeah.
100 million?
It's going to be 100 million. The difference between the quantity that Americans are going to want to buy and the quantity that American producers are going to want to sell. Whatever that horizontal difference is the amount of the imports. When we have foreign trade, will we always be importing? Well, obviously not. There are going to be some products, many products, where U.S. producers have a comparative advantage and where the world price is going to be higher than the domestic price. And then if the world supply curve were up here, then we'd work through it the same way, but we would have American producers producing more than the American consumers wanted, and the horizontal gap would be the amount that we were going to export. Okay, we're not going to go through that, but it would work very much the same way. Okay, we did that. We did that. Now let's ask the question, where are the gains from trade now that we are able to trade with people in other countries? And in the next graph, we've already identified gains from trade when it was just a closed economy. Closed economy means we can't trade with people in other countries. An open economy, that just means we have the ability to trade with people in other countries. So what are the, what's the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the gains from trade when we have an open economy where we can trade with people in other countries? And here you have the graph, but I put in some numbers to identify these different parts. So on your paper, you should have a graph. Now put in those numbers. And for a minute, think about it. Where is the consumer surplus now? Where's the producer surplus now? And even though it looks more complicated, always remember just the basic idea. Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price line. Producer surplus is the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that.
It's going to take me more than 30 seconds to draw all that. But I can guess. It'll be a scientific wild-ass guess. I think it's going to be worth a shot. Nothing ventured.
Okay. Somebody take a shot at it.
Okay.
What areas would be included in consumer surplus?
2, 4, and 5.
Okay. Is that the 2, 4, and 5 is the answer that someone's given? Is that the total consumer surplus?
No.
No, why not?
Because area 1 has to be factored in too, because it's above the supply price, and that's the consumer surplus.
Right, area 1 does have to be included, because again, always go back to our shortcut for finding the consumer surplus. Area below the demand curve and above the price line, but you got to make sure you know which price line is relevant. When we had the closed economy, the price was here, and so the area below demand and above the price line was just area 1. But now that we have an open economy with free trade, this price is irrelevant. This is now the price. Right? And so the area below the demand curve and above the price line would be area 1, 2, 4, and 5. Okay? So clearly, clearly the consumers are benefiting tremendously from the ability to trade with other producers in the rest of the world. Consumer surplus is going from just 1 to 1 plus 2, 4, and 5. So consumers are getting a huge benefit. And that's just kind of quantifying what common sense tells us, that when the consumers are paying $16 per unit, and now they can buy it for only $10 per unit, well, obviously they're going to be made better off. Okay? But we are able to quantify it, and that's going to be important in just a minute. All right, so now where is the producer surplus now that we have free trade with the rest of the world?
Section 3.
It's going to be area 3. And again, it's easy if you just remember what to look for. The area below the price line, and if we're trading with the rest of the world, this is the only price that matters, below the price line and above the supply curve. So that's going to be area 3. So consumer surplus would be the 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 5. Producer surplus would be area 3. And then total gains from trade would just be consumer surplus plus producer surplus 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. And so what if we think in terms of what was the change that occurred? Okay? How did consumer surplus change from the ability to trade, and how did producer surplus? Because here we see something very important. When we have the ability to trade with producers in other countries, okay, not every single entity here is going to benefit. Okay? Now, all parties, before we've said that when you have an exchange, all parties to that exchange benefit, otherwise they wouldn't enter into it. Okay? But here, producers, American producers, are not going to benefit from the introduction of trade in this market. Okay? Now, if we're opening up the whole economy, then the people who are producing this product, they're going to benefit because they're going to be able to buy other products more cheaply. Okay? But the fact that these American producers are facing more competition from foreign producers, that is not going to benefit these American producers. It's going to hurt them. And we see that here. Notice consumer surplus previously was just area 1. We said when we open it up to trade, it becomes 1, 2, 4, and 5. So the net change in consumer surplus is plus 2, plus 4, plus 5. That is the gain that consumers are getting. Yeah.
In the total gains from trade, why isn't area 1 included in the consumer surplus?
Well, consumer surplus, area 1 will be included in consumer surplus. And what we did a moment ago, we included it.
Oh,
All I'm doing here, I'm not identifying the consumer surplus. I'm identifying the change,
okay.
the gains and the losses. So we're looking at the same thing, but from a slightly different perspective. The gains and the losses. And for consumer surplus, it was area 1. Now it's going to be 1, 2, 4, and 5. So the gain to consumers from having the ability to trade is 2 plus 4 plus 5.
Okay, so that the mathematical part is, these are the new areas.
These are the new areas. That's right. That's right. And so it's important. And here you will see why the graph is actually worth the trouble, because non-economists tend to look at issues like trade and say, well, yeah, of course we open up this market to free trade. Of course the consumers are going to benefit because they're going to pay a lower price. But the producers, now they're going to get a lower price. The producers are going to be hurt. And so a lot of people look at these issues and they say, well, okay, you've got consumers benefiting, you've got producers being hurt. So, you know, we really don't know if this is a good idea or not. The graph is about to show us that, yes, the consumers are benefiting, the producers are being hurt, but the graph makes it very clear that the gains to the consumers are greater than the cost to the producers, with the end result that efficiency improves. The consumers are getting a benefit that's greater than the cost the producers are bearing. So it's not just a matter of, well, do we want to help the consumers or do we want to help the producers? It's the fundamental question is, do we want to use our resources efficiently? Do we want to buy output from the low-cost producer, or do we want to simply protect American producers? And so notice what we said. We already said by opening the market to trade, consumers get a benefit represented by 2, 4, and 5. Okay? Producers, remember before trade, if you go back to one of the earlier graphs, producer surplus had been 2 plus 3. When we open the market to trade with other countries and the price goes down, producer surplus drops just to 3. So when the producers say this is going to hurt us, they are not lying. They correctly perceive they are going to be hurt by this trade, by additional competition from foreign producers. And the producers are going to lose area 2 because their producer surplus was 2 plus 3. Now it is reduced to 3. So what do we see? Consumers gained 2, 4, and 5. Producers lose 2. So if you put all those gains and losses together, you see the 2's cancel out. You're left with plus 4 and plus 5. So all things taken together, the gain to society is going to be greater if we allow, or the gains from trade are going to be greater if we allow trade with producers in other countries. And those the efficiencies, remember we said it's going to be 4 and 5. That's the net gain. Notice that is this area here and that area there. Okay. And if we think about it a little bit, then we can understand what those areas are representing. Okay. We just said those represent the gains from opening up to trade. We can understand it a little better. Okay? And let's see, here's just a graph that shows you the imports. It's a little clearly, it doesn't have all my markings on it. Well, stick with this. Think about Area 5. Any guess as to why that would represent a gain? Who's that a gain to? The demand, that's a gain. Give me a second, I've got a bug flying all over my. Okay. Area 5 is a gain going to the demanders, to consumers. Okay? Before trade, consumers were getting 100 million units. After trade, they're getting 150 million units. Area 5 is the consumer surplus that consumers are getting on the additional 50 million units that they are now consuming. Okay? They were getting only 100. Now they're going to be consuming 150. So they're getting an extra 50 million units to consume, to enjoy. And how do we find consumer surplus? It's always the area below the demand curve and above the price line. So the benefit to consumers of these extra 50 million units would be the area under the demand curve. Well, the maximum they would be willing to pay would be the area under the demand curve between 100 million and 150. That is what they would be willing to pay for those extra units. What do they actually have to pay? Well, they have to pay the world price, which is represented here, and that's an extra 50 million. So that would be this dimension. So the amount they have to pay for those extra units is this area. So because of the ability to trade with other countries, consumers are getting an extra 50 million units of this product. They would be willing to pay all of this. They only have to pay this much. So area 5 represents additional consumer surplus. It's an additional gain consumers are getting because they're able to purchase additional units of this product. Okay? And they're able to do that because they can now buy it at a price that is lower than before. Okay? Now, think about area 4. Okay? That has to do with.
Isn't that the producer side?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that the producer side?
This is going to have to do with producers. Okay? And it has to do with this 50 million here. Okay? Before trade, consumers were getting 100 million. Okay? Well, we're now looking at this 50 million that they were already getting. Okay? And the cost of producing that 50 million, excuse me, the cost of producing that 50 million when it was produced by American companies would be represented by the area under the supply curve. Okay? Now that we can purchase that 50 million at a cost of only $10, okay, the cost of producing this 50 million is no longer this huge area here under the supply curve. It's now just this rectangle. Okay? So because we can now purchase this 50 million from foreign producers who can produce at a lower cost than can US producers produce. We are able to purchase, or the cost of getting this 50 million units is now lower than it was before. And the reduction in cost is represented by this area 4. Okay? So area 4 and area 5 are the two areas that represent the gains that we're getting from being able to trade with low-cost foreign producers. Area 5 is the extra consumer surplus consumers are getting because they're able to consume more. Area 4 is a savings in production cost, because whereas these units were being produced by American producers at a relatively high cost, now that we can buy those units at a price of only $10, the production cost is going to be reduced by 4, or by the area represented there by 4. So the total gains from being able to purchase this product at the world price would be represented by area 4 and area 5. Okay? Does every single person benefit here? No, the producers are worse off. And when they tell us we're being hurt by this, you know, we have to say, yeah, we see that you are being hurt by this. But we can point out that if we open all of the markets to trade, then that means that cost for other products that the producer is going to be buying, those costs are going to be going down. So the American producers as consumers will benefit, and there will be other American producers who will be exporters and who are going to gain. Okay? So you know, this is basically the economic argument for free trade, that it benefits the economy as a whole because it gives us a more efficient use of our resources. Okay? All right. So we've made the case. We've shown the efficiency of allowing trade to occur. The intuition of it is when you have free trade, it lets everybody buy from the producer who offers them the best deal. That's the intuition of it. We've shown the graph. We see you know, the geometry of it. You can't really argue with. Does that mean that everybody is in agreement that free trade's a good thing? Absolutely not. Producers, they know that in their own markets, they're hurt by free trade. Free trade doesn't hurt producers as a group, but for each producer, when they have to compete against foreign producers, it does hurt them. And so you do have a lot of opposition to free trade, and that opposition leads to demands for protectionist policies. And protectionist policies can come in the form of a tariff or a quota. And they have similar effects, but they're somewhat different. A tariff is just a tax on imports. So if you have, we talked back in chapter 6, I think, about commodity taxes, you know, tax on cigarettes or things like that. Well, this is the same kind of thing, except it's a tax that American producers don't have to pay. Only foreign producers have to pay it. And we'll take a look at the effects in just a moment. A quota is where we impose restrictions on the quantity of goods that can be imported. Yeah.
The thing that reminds me of the quota is in China, there's only so many American-made movies that can be brought in. So everybody wants to have their movie meet that quota or be in that group of movies that meets the quota.
Okay. The comment is that in China, only a certain number of American movies are allowed to be brought in. I don't know the details of that, but assuming that's right, that would be an example of a quota where the government is saying, we're not going to cut off trade, but we're going to limit the amount that can be brought in. And there've been times where we have had quotas on Japanese cars that were brought into this country, not imposing a tax on them, but we are saying we're not going to allow more than a certain number to be brought into the country. So let's say if U.S. restricts the number of cars to be imported at 50,000 per month, this is an example of a quota. Okay? Certainly not an example of free trade. Free trade would be where the government does not try. Free trade is the opposite of protectionist policy. With protectionist policy, such as a tariff or a quota, the government is trying to protect American producers from foreign producers from competition. With free trade, the government is not trying to protect any given business. The government is trying to make trade easier. And when that is done, that has the effect of protecting consumers, because then consumers get to buy from whoever offers them the best deal. Okay. Think about what we've done so far today. We started looking at the gains and the losses, or the benefits when we have free trade in a closed economy. Then we said, well, what if we open our trade up to the world markets, and so that we can trade with foreign producers? We saw that produces net gains to society. Our areas, I think it was 3 and 4, that yes, producers lose in some markets, but the gains to consumers are going to be greater than the losses to producers. So there's an efficiency gain. So from an efficiency standpoint, free trade is a good thing. But you do have a lot of producers who go to the government and want protection from foreign competition. And one way to provide protection to producers, we should emphasize that protectionist policies, the goal isn't to protect this country. Don't think of it as, are we going to help Americans or help the people in other countries? It's always protecting American producers. And it's at the expense of American consumers. It's important to keep in mind, and we'll see that here. So here we have, again, it's a new graph, so look at it carefully. Got a domestic supply curve, nothing new there. Got a domestic demand curve here. Somehow the D got left off. We got a world supply curve. So just ignore the red line there for now. We would say that without the red line, this is exactly what we had before. The price would be the world price. That's again, assume that's $10. And at that $10, think about how you think through what's going on here. The world price is $10. It means Americans can purchase as much as they want at that price. So how much will they want? Well, you go to the demand curve. Go there. This is the quantity Americans will want to buy. I think we said 150 before. At that price, how much will American producers want to produce? Well, we read over to the domestic supply curve and down. Let's assume that's 50 still. So we've got American consumers wanting 150 million, American producers producing 50 million. So the gap there is the amount that will be imported. Okay? And we said that's, in terms of efficiency, that's an efficient outcome. But producers don't like that. If they go to the government and if they convince the government that a tariff should be imposed, okay, we can easily think through what the consequences are going to be. Let's say that $3 per unit tariff is imposed. Okay? Well, that's a $3 tax on foreign producers. And we'll go back to chapter 6 where we talked about taxes. When you impose a tax on a commodity tax on a product, that is adding to the cost of producing the product, producing and selling it. And so a $3 tax will shift the supply curve up by $3. So the world supply, which was horizontal here at $10, once we impose the tariff, now it is going to be still horizontal, but it is going to be horizontal at $13. Okay? So now that we've shifted the supply curve, we think about what does this mean? How are American consumers affected? How are American producers affected? How will our imports be affected? And is there anybody else who's going to be affected? Okay? So price is going to be $13. Let's go ahead and put in here what we assumed before, which was that if we did not have any, if we had a closed economy, the price would be 16. Okay? So the price is now going to be 13. What will consumers want to do? I'll read over to the demand curve, read down. American consumers are going to want to purchase this quantity, whatever it is. And I'm just going to make an assumption. We don't know what it is unless we had a good scale here. Well, let's say it's 130 million. Okay. What else can we say? Is this going to affect American producers at all?
Yes.
It will. What's the effect going to be? How do American producers respond?
Let's see. They're going to
Where do you, when you want to see what producers are going to do, what curve do you look at?
the supply.
You look at the supply curve. And the price was $10. So U.S. producers wanted to provide 50 million. Now that the price has gone up by $3 to 13, U.S. producers want to supply. It's profitable to them to supply more. So U.S. producers are going to move from here over to here. And the quantity that U.S. producers will provide is now going to be whatever this quantity is. And we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but let's just say it's 70 million. Okay. So we see two effects of the tariff. American consumers cut back on the amount that they will consume. American producers increase the amount that they want to supply. Are we still going to import anything?
Yes.
We know we're going to import because consumers are going to consume 130 million, but U.S. producers are only going to produce 70. So the only way we can consume more than we produce is if we import. And so, as before, the amount that we import is going to be determined by the difference between this point and this point. It's the difference between what we're consuming domestically and what our domestic producers are producing. And so that's going to be the difference between 130 and 70. That's going to be 60 million. Our imports had been 100 million. Because of the tariff, it reduces our imports to 60 million. Now, how should we evaluate the tariff? The intention of the tariff is to protect and help American producers, and it certainly does that. American producers are going to get a higher price, and they're now going to be able to sell more. And the higher the tariff, the more they get to charge, and the higher quantity they will be willing and able to produce and sell. Okay? So American producers in this market are going to be benefits. American consumers, how are they affected?
They're going to lose 20 million units consumed.
American consumers are, we'll get into the details in a second, but American consumers are going to be hurt because they are paying a higher price and they're not going to be consuming as much. So many people would look at this and say, well, you know, we imposed the tariff and it's going to protect American producers. So it's a good thing. Well, economics teaches us, reminds us, we need to look at all of the effects. And yes, it is helping producers in this market, but it is hurting consumers in this market. And so we need to try to assess, well, how do those benefits and those costs compare? If there was a benefit to the producer and no cost to anybody else, well then yeah, this would be a good thing. If the benefit to producers was great and the cost to consumers was really, really small, then you would be tempted to say, well, yeah, maybe it's worth it. But what we're going to see is that when we impose the tariff, it will produce a benefit for U.S. producers, but at a cost to consumers, to U.S. consumers, that will be greater than the benefit that the producers are going to get. Okay? And you know, this is complicated. And in discussions of trade, it's easy to if they were having a hearing in Washington and trying to decide, well, should we impose this tariff? It's going to help the producers and it's going to hurt the consumers. And if they're having a hearing in Washington, then no doubt they would bring out some producers who would talk about how their business is going to be devastated if you don't have this tariff. Okay? And so you bring out some examples, and the government tends to make decisions based on these individuals who are making an emotional case, and then you don't think about, but what about the consumers? What about the fact there are millions of consumers who are going to be hurt? The graph is a good way to measure the benefits and the cost, and to do it in an objective way. And so let's think about how we would do that. When we impose the tariff, as we just said, the amount of imports will drop. Okay? The imports were going to be this big area, 100 million. Imports are going to be smaller. Okay? U.S. consumption is going to be smaller. U.S. production is going to be greater. Okay? One of the things we have to be careful about is people will sometimes say, well, this is a good thing because this means that American companies are producing more output. Well, it does mean that these American companies will be producing more of this product. But is that a good thing? If they are high-cost producers, and if we could purchase this output more cheaply from another country, then maybe we don't want these producers producing this output. Maybe these producers, maybe it would be better for them to not be in business. It would be better for them to take their resources and find something else to produce, something that they have a comparative advantage on. Okay? There are a lot of emotional arguments that can be brought into the discussion, but if you use the graph, there's not a whole lot of emotion in that graph. And so we want to use this graph to figure out where the benefits and where the costs are going to be. So, another quiz. In the next graph, and this is, you will have something like this on the exam. In the next graph, identify the gains and losses from the tariff to consumers, to producers, to anybody else that, if there's somebody we should take into account, and then to society as a whole. Okay? So here we have the previous graph. Everything's the same except I have numbered these different areas. This is area 1, this is area 2, area 3 is in red here, okay, and this is area 4. So we know that, I'll give you a minute to copy down that graph and think about it. I'll be right back.
Jesus.
Okay. We want to identify who gains and what they gain or lose. And then we want to try to put it all together. Okay? We know consumers are going to be affected. We know producers are going to be affected. Anybody else going to be affected here?
The government also?
The government. We do have to take into account the government because the tariff is a tax, and that tax revenue is going to go to the government. So that's a benefit that we should take into account. Okay? Well, let's start by thinking about how are consumers going to be affected. First, are they going to benefit or be hurt by the tariff?
The consumers are going to take a loss.
They're going to be hurt, obviously, because they're going to pay a higher price. Okay? And when the price goes up, we know what they're going to do. The law of demand tells us they're going to cut back on the amount they consume. How do we determine by how much they are affected? Well, consumer surplus. All we have to do is ask, when we have free trade, where is the consumer surplus? And when we impose the tariff, where is the consumer surplus? And then compare the two. So, what is consumer surplus? It's the area where?
It's going to be above the price line.
Where is consumer surplus? Always. Go ahead.
Area below the demand curve, above the price line.
It is all, and I would say always say it the same way. Even if you're just thinking it, always say it the same way so that it becomes a habit so that you don't make mistakes. Where is consumer surplus? It's always the area below the demand curve and above the price line. So when we have free trade before the tariff, then the consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve and above the price line. Well, before the tariff, the price is here. So this is the relevant price line. And so with free trade, consumer surplus is going to be the entire area below the demand curve, all of this, and above the price line. How far out do we go? Well, out to the quantity that consumers are going to want to buy. And at that, still assume that's $10. At that $10 price, this is the quantity consumers will want. Let's say 100. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that's 150. That's
Yeah.
what they want.
That's 150. So before the tariff, when we have free trade, consumer surplus is all of this area. Okay, it's the big area here plus, well, it's everything. Okay, everything above the. I told you to say it the same way every time. Area below the demand curve and above the price line. So it's this big triangle. When we impose the tariff, consumer surplus is still the area under the demand curve and above the price line. But now this is the relevant price line. Okay? So it is the area below the demand curve, but above the red line. Okay? Before the tariff, it included all of this. Okay? After the tariff, it only goes down to the red line. Still the area below the demand curve, but it only goes down to the red line. In other words, what has happened to consumer surplus because of the tariff?
It's shrunk by a percentage.
It has shrunk, and which areas represent the reduction in consumer surplus? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because you got the big triangle there, and after the tariff, consumer surplus has shrunk to the blue triangle. Okay? So the difference between the two would be this area 1, 2, 3, and 4. So consumers are losing, and the amount of their loss is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? So the effect on consumers is they're losing 1, they're losing 2, they're losing 3, and they're losing 4. Okay? So now we have to look at okay, we'll use this one. Now we need to think about the other parties involved, the producers and the government. I think we'll have time to do this. When we had free trade, before the tariff, where was the producer surplus? Just remember, always, what is producer surplus? It's the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So when we had free trade, the producer surplus, this was the price line, this is the supply curve. So the producer surplus was that area. The tariff raises the price up to the red line. And so now the producer surplus, still the same definition, the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So the producer surplus now is all of that green area. Okay? So before the tariff, producers were getting the blue area. Now they're getting the blue area plus the green area, which means the gain to the producers is area 1. Okay? So we've done two things. We've identified the loss to consumers. They're losing 1, 2, 3, and 4. We've identified the gain to producers. That's area 1. And now we got to think about the government. Okay? The government is getting a tariff. They're getting tax revenue. The amount of the tariff is represented by that horizontal distance.
It's represented by the what?
The amount of the tariff is that horizontal distance. Because remember, we shifted it up by $3 because we assumed that it was a $3 tariff. So the government is getting that amount per unit imported. How much is being imported?
I think it was 130.
It, no, it was, I forget the exact, I don't think that was it. But on the graph, consumers are now buying this quantity. American producers are producing this quantity. So the difference there is the amount that we are importing. So the government is going to get this much per unit imported. We're going to import this many units. So the amount of revenue the government gets is the tariff per unit times the number of units. So the government is going to get revenue equal to that area in red, which I'm calling area 3. Okay, so now we pretty much got everything we need. Let's see if I can get this on the graph. I'm not sure why that's off the screen. Okay. We said the loss to consumers is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. We said the gain to producers is area 1. Okay. See there. The gain to producer or to the government is area 3. So we're losing 1 through 4. We're gaining 1 and 3. Add all of it together. The net effect is to lose area 2 and area 4. Okay? By imposing the tariff, are the producers benefiting? Yes. Is the government benefiting? Yes. But the benefits to the government and the producers, the benefits are outweighed by the cost. The consumers are being hurt more than the other parties are gaining, which is why we would say that a tariff creates a deadweight loss. Having the ability to trade freely with other countries, we saw that produced an efficiency gain. Well, when you have a tariff, that reduces that gain. And it means we're going to be using our resources less efficiently than before. And notice the amount of the loss is area 2 and area 4. Think about what do those areas represent. Okay? If we're out of time, if you can describe to me what area 2 and area 4 represent. Okay? Send me an email with that and I'll give you 2 points of extra credit on the next exam. Okay? Also, if you have anything that you especially like about the textbook or you don't like about the textbook, send me an email and explain that to me, because I'm about to go to a virtual conference where the authors of the textbook are going to be there and they have questions and answers, and I'd like to have something to convey if you like things you like or things you don't like. So, but I will be doing that tomorrow. So if you could send that to me today, that would be great. All right, any questions?
I'll wait till everybody knows.
Okay. All right, have a good weekend.